What if Iran actually saw this coming weeks before it happened and still couldn't stop it? What if every warning sign was sitting right there in plain sight and it still wasn't enough to change the outcome? Before we go any further, if that thought just made you pause, tap like right now. It genuinely helps this video reach more people who need to understand what really happened here. Subscribe if you want the full picture, not just the headlines. And if you know someone who still thinks this was sudden, send them this video because it wasn't sudden at all. Let's start with something simple. A warning only matters if someone is ready to act on it. Iran had warnings, plenty of them. Satellite images, troop movements, diplomatic silence, where there used to be noise. Analysts inside the country and outside of it were saying the same thing for months. Something was coming. And yet, when it finally arrived, Iran was still standing in the wrong place, holding the wrong tools, a step behind a plan that had already been finished long before the first missile ever left the ground. That gap between knowing and being ready is the entire story here. It's not a story about surprise. It's a story about timing, about how seeing danger coming and actually surviving it are two completely different skills. And this year, Iran learned that lesson in the most brutal way possible. To understand how this all unfolded, you have to go back further than most people realize. This wasn't a conflict that started with a single strike. It was built slowly, over years, through smaller moments that most of the world barely noticed at the time. Quiet warnings from intelligence agencies, small skirmishes that never made front-page news, sanctions that tightened bit by bit until an entire economy was gasping for air. Iran's leadership knew all of this. They talked about it publicly, even bragged about their ability to withstand pressure. But knowing pressure exists and knowing exactly when it will break are not the same thing. Months before the major strikes that most people remember, there was already an earlier operation. American aircraft had struck Iran's nuclear enrichment sites using massive bombs built specifically to punch through mountains of rock and layers of reinforced concrete. At the time, officials described it as a limited, one-time action. A sharp blow meant to slow things down, not a declaration of open war. Iran's government reacted publicly with defiance, promising retaliation and describing the strike as an act that would not go unanswered. But behind that public defiance, something else was happening. Quietly, without fanfare, the United States began repositioning forces across the region. Carrier groups shifted position. Additional squadrons arrived at bases that usually sat half empty. Special operations units moved into staging areas that hadn't seen this kind of activity in years. Officially, all of this was framed as protective, a precaution, a way to keep American citizens and allies safe in case tensions escalated further. Iran's intelligence services almost certainly noticed. There is no way a buildup of that scale goes completely undetected, especially by a country that has spent decades building its own web of informants and surveillance across the region. Reports later suggested Iranian officials were aware that something larger was being prepared. Meetings were held, contingency plans were drawn up. Statements were made in private about the need to be ready for a wider confrontation. And still, when the larger campaign actually began, it landed with a force that seemed to catch even the most prepared parts of the Iranian government off guard. Within the first day, more than 1,000 locations across the country were struck. Stealth bombers, fighter jets, electronic warfare aircraft, and support planes worked together in a coordinated effort designed to blind Iran's defenses before it could even fully understand what was happening. Senior leadership figures were killed in those opening hours. Communication networks were disrupted. The speed of it all seemed to outpace whatever plans had been made in the weeks before. This is where the tension in this story really lives, not in the question of whether Iran knew trouble was coming, but in the question of why knowing wasn't enough. Why does a country with real intelligence, capability, real military infrastructure, and years of preparation still end up absorbing a blow this severe? Think about how strange that really is. Iran isn't a small, isolated nation caught off guard by something it never expected. This is a country that has spent decades building proxy networks, intelligence pipelines, and layered defense systems specifically designed to detect exactly this kind of threat years in advance. It had time. It had resources. It had, on paper, everything it needed to prepare a serious response. And still, when the moment actually came, the gap between preparation and reality turned out to be far wider than anyone inside the country was willing to admit publicly. Part of the answer lies in something painfully human. Knowing danger exists in the abstract is very different from believing it will actually happen to you on a specific day in a specific way. Iranian officials had heard warnings about American and Israeli action for years. Threats had been made before and walked back before. Tensions had spiked before and cooled before. There was a pattern, and patterns create a kind of dangerous comfort. If something has happened many times without turning into full-scale war, it becomes easier to assume it never will. That assumption, more than any single military failure, may have cost Iran precious time it never got back. Once the fighting started, it didn't stay one-sided for long. Iran responded with ballistic missiles and drones aimed at American positions across the region. Naval forces intercepted incoming fire around the clock, missile defense systems working non-stop to stop what they could. 2 American aircraft carriers were already positioned nearby when the campaign began, one in the Arabian Sea, another close to Israel in the Mediterranean. At one point, Iranian forces struck the United Arab Emirates directly in an attempt to hit American assets stationed there, killing foreign workers and injuring dozens more in the process. American service members were killed and wounded as well. This wasn't a war fought from a comfortable distance. Real people paid the price on every side of it. And it wasn't cheap either. Reports from senior military officials revealed that American forces intercepted more than 1,700 Iranian missiles and drones over the course of the campaign. Each interception came with a cost attached. Estimates suggest close to 1,000 cruise missiles were used from a stockpile of around 3,000, along with more than 1,000 long-range standoff weapons from a much larger inventory. Precision munitions from Army stockpiles were drawn down heavily as well. Defense planners back home began quietly worrying about something bigger than this one conflict. If a campaign against a country widely seen as weaker than Russia or China could burn through weapons this quickly, what would happen in a longer, harder fight somewhere else in the world? That single worry, tucked away in budget meetings far from any battlefield, ends up shaping almost everything that happens later in this story. Keep it in the back of your mind, because it comes back around in a way that connects directly to why Iran currently has no real answer for what's coming next. It's worth pausing here to understand just how unusual that worry actually is. This is supposed to be the most powerful military on Earth, fighting a country with a fraction of its budget, a fraction of its technology, and a fraction of its air power. And even so, warehouses full of expensive precision weapons were being emptied fast enough to alarm the very people responsible for managing them. Wars are typically won by whoever has options left when the other side runs out. If the stronger side is burning through its own supply this quickly against a weaker opponent, that isn't just an accounting problem sitting quietly on a spreadsheet somewhere. It's an early warning sign about what a longer, harder conflict against a genuinely capable rival could actually look like. Now let's talk about the sky itself, because that's where this entire war has actually been decided. The B-2 stealth bomber carried an enormous share of the load throughout this campaign. Fewer than 20 of these aircraft remain in active service, flying out of a single base, their unusual flying wing shape and radar-absorbing skin allowing them to travel. Thousands of miles largely unseen. Not a single B-2 involved in this campaign has reportedly been hit, not once. But it was a different aircraft that ended up telling the more revealing story. The B-1B Lancer, built for speed and firepower rather than stealth, was pulled into missions striking Iran's military command structure. These bombers reportedly flew non-stop from the American mainland, carrying payloads larger than almost anything else in the current fleet, hitting command centers and missile sites in the days following the initial leadership strikes. And then something unusual showed up in photographs taken near an American airbase months earlier, something that quietly explains a lot about why Iran, despite every warning sign it had, still couldn't build a real defense in time. A B-1B was seen flying with a missile mounted externally beneath its body. Not just any missile, this one had a history. It had been declared finished years earlier. Funding pulled, program closed, engineers reassigned to other projects. On paper, this weapon didn't exist anymore. And yet, here it was, hanging off the wing of an active combat aircraft. At almost the exact same time, American bombers were flying repeated missions over Iranian airspace. That timing is not a coincidence. A canceled weapon doesn't simply reappear on a live combat aircraft during an active war for no reason. Something forced that decision. And understanding why takes us back to the missile's own troubled history. This weapon began development years ago with a bold promise attached to it. Launch it from a fighter or bomber, let it climb to an altitude of roughly 100,000 feet, release a hypersonic glide vehicle, and steer that vehicle toward a target more than 1,000 miles away at speeds almost nothing on Earth could reliably catch. It sounded like the future of air power. Then testing began, and everything fell apart. One early test failed because the missile wouldn't even separate from its carrier aircraft. Another failed when the booster refused to ignite. A third was aborted before it could fire at all. Year after year, the program limped forward, chasing failure after failure. Eventually, the booster technology started working properly, and the first fully successful test flight happened. Just months later, another test failed for reasons that were never fully explained to the public. By then, lawmakers had seen enough. Funding was zeroed out completely. On paper, the weapon was dead. A cautionary tale about ambition running ahead of engineering. For a while, that really was the end of the story. Defense analysts moved on. Budget committees redirected their attention elsewhere. It became the kind of program people brought up as an example of good money spent on a bad result. Right? Here is where everything changes. and it's the part that gives this entire story its real weight. Quiet momentum had actually been building behind the scenes long before this war ever started, driven by planners increasingly uneasy about the fact that the United States had no operational air-launched hypersonic weapon of its own, while other major powers already did. But it was this specific war against Iran that finally forced the decision. The campaign exposed two uncomfortable truths nobody could keep ignoring. First, how fast weapon stockpiles could be drained, fighting even a country widely viewed as less capable and less equipped. Second, how valuable a fast, difficult-to-intercept strike weapon would be against high-value, fast-moving targets like mobile missile launchers that only sit in one place for a matter of minutes. Budget requests for the following year suddenly included well over $200 million to fund a new version of this exact missile, reportedly carrying an upgraded guidance system capable of striking moving targets, including ships at sea. A program that had been formally killed by lawmakers found its way back into the federal budget, back onto an active combat aircraft, and back into a real war zone, all within roughly 3 years. We're at almost the halfway point of this story now, and honestly, this is exactly where it deserves a moment to breathe. If you've made it this far, you clearly care about understanding what's actually happening here instead of just skimming a headline somewhere. So do this for me. Comment one word that describes how you think Iran responds to all of this. I read these, and they genuinely shape what gets covered in future videos like this one. It helps to understand why this missile existed in the first place, because that context makes its sudden return even more meaningful. This program was never really built with Iran in mind. It was designed as a response to China and Russia, both of which had already developed and fielded their own working hypersonic glide weapons years earlier. The United States, by comparison, had nothing equivalent ready to deploy. Seen against that backdrop, a previously canceled missile getting rushed back onto an active bomber during a live war isn't just about hitting targets inside Iran faster. It's a message aimed just as much at Beijing and Moscow. A signal that a gap adversaries have pointed to for years is finally starting to close. There's a strange kind of irony sitting inside all of this, if you think about it for more than a moment. A weapon built with China and Russia in mind ended up getting something close to its real debut over Iran instead. That's not how anyone drew this up on paper years ago, but conflicts rarely follow the script written inside defense planning documents. Sometimes a weapon built for one kind of enemy ends up proving itself against a completely different one, simply because that's where the opportunity to use it under real conditions happened to appear first. Now let's actually look at why a weapon like this is so difficult to stop, because this is where the story stops being about politics and starts being about pure physics. This missile belongs to a category known as a boost-glide hypersonic weapon. A solid rocket motor accelerates an unpowered glide vehicle to extreme speed and altitude. Once the booster falls away, that glide vehicle doesn't follow a predictable curved path the way a normal missile does. It flies low, fast, and unpredictably, adjusting its course mid-flight in ways that dramatically shrink the amount of time any defense system has to detect it, calculate its path, and actually respond. Traditional air defense systems, the kind Iran currently relies on, are built around an assumption that targets follow a fairly stable, predictable trajectory. A weapon capable of changing direction unpredictably while moving it several times. The speed of sound breaks that assumption completely. That's not exaggerated language for dramatic effect. That's the actual reasoning behind why the United States, Russia, and China have collectively spent billions of dollars developing exactly this category of weapon over the past decade. Iran is fully aware this gap exists because it has spent years trying to build something similar of its own. Iranian officials have claimed to possess and use a missile they describe as hypersonic, reportedly firing it toward regional targets earlier this year. But there's an important detail that has to be included here, honestly. Independent analysts have publicly challenged those claims, describing the labeling around Iran's system as questionable. At best, arguing the term obscures more than it explains when applied to that particular weapon. In simple terms, Iran says it has something capable of evading modern missile defenses. Independent experts remain far less convinced it actually performs that way in practice. That's a real unresolved disagreement in the public record, and it deserves to be said plainly rather than smoothed over. So how weakened are Iran's defenses, really? Because that answer determines whether the country has any genuine response to a weapon like this at all. The backbone of Iran's strategic air defense network arrived years ago through a handful of advanced systems positioned around the capital and around key nuclear sites. That network was never especially large to begin with, particularly compared to what other major powers maintain for their own protection. And even that limited setup had already been worn down significantly in the years leading up to this war, with key radar and tracking components destroyed in earlier strikes. As the campaign intensified, Satellite images showed Iran scrambling to reposition whatever launchers remained, a sign that some capability had survived the opening strikes, but only barely. Weeks into the fighting, military officials formally declared control over Iranian airspace, citing tens of thousands of combat missions flown and roughly 12,000 destroyed targets, alongside a sharp drop in Iran's drone attacks and ballistic missile output. Separate reporting suggested a large majority of Iran's weapons production facilities had been struck, effectively crippling its ability to rebuild its defense industry for years to come. And yet, despite all of that, Iran's defenses have been accurately described as battered but still biting. Not long after those sweeping declarations of air superiority, an American fighter jet was shot down over western Iran, triggering a massive rescue operation involving hundreds of troops and dozens of aircraft. The pilot was recovered roughly 7 hours after the crash, but that rescue came at a real cost, with American forces reportedly destroying several of their own aircraft to prevent them from being captured. Several Iranian military personnel were reported killed during the same operation. This single incident matters enormously because it's a reminder that even a badly damaged defense network hasn't simply vanished. Portable, shoulder-fired defense systems are believed to have played a role in that shootdown. Proof that even after losing most of its long-range radar-guided systems, Iran can still threaten aircraft flying at lower altitudes. Senior officials have since cautioned that despite the impressive destruction numbers being publicized, Iran's overall military capability has not been fully eliminated. That distinction matters enormously for the weapon sitting at the center of this story. A weakened, patchy air defense network built around aging systems might occasionally get lucky against a slower, non-stealth aircraft, the way it apparently did in that one incident. But those systems were designed decades ago around slow, predictable, non-maneuvering threats. A hypersonic glide vehicle capable of changing direction. Mid-flight at several times. The speed of sound is a completely different category of problem, one that even fully intact modern defense networks around the world are still struggling to reliably solve. There have also been reports suggesting Iran may have quietly replaced parts of its damaged network with newer systems, along with unverified claims about additional foreign-supplied defenses entering the country. Even taking the most generous version of those reports at face value, none of it changes the underlying physics problem, sitting beneath all of it. Nothing currently in Iran's known inventory, replenished or not, was ever designed to intercept a maneuvering hypersonic glide vehicle, and that is precisely the gap this revived missile is built to exploit. It's worth sitting with just how different this challenge is compared to anything Iran has dealt with before in this conflict. Shooting down a slow-moving drone is one kind of problem. Tracking a ballistic missile along a predictable arc is another, difficult but at least mathematically solvable with the right radar and interceptor combination working together. A maneuvering hypersonic glide vehicle throws that entire math problem out the window. Defense planners in multiple countries, not just Iran, have spent the last decade trying to build systems capable of reliably catching something that moves this fast and changes direction this unpredictably. Most of those efforts are still years away from being proven reliable under real combat conditions. Iran, with a defense network already stretched thin and partially destroyed, is nowhere close to solving a problem that fully resourced, technologically advanced militaries haven't even solved yet. Before we go further, here's one more thing worth doing right now. If this kind of careful, detailed breakdown is genuinely useful to you, hit subscribe and turn on notifications, because the next update on this exact weapon and this exact war is coming sooner than most people expect, and you don't want to be the last one to see it. This hypersonic story doesn't exist by itself either. There's a much wider pattern of new, lower-profile weapons quietly reshaping this entire conflict, and it's worth understanding because it shows this war has effectively become a live testing ground for next-generation military technology on every side involved. Officials have confirmed the first real combat use of several previously untested systems during this campaign, including new precision strike missiles and unmanned combat platforms, without releasing a complete public list of everything, making its debut. From upgraded Iranian weapons to newly deployed American systems, this conflict has quietly become a proving ground for hardware that had never faced a real adversary before. There's also a separate hypersonic program worth mentioning briefly, because it's easy to confuse it with the missile at the center of this story, even though it belongs to a completely different branch of the military. Reports emerged that Regional Command had requested deployment of the Army's own long-delayed hypersonic weapon to the Middle East, specifically to strike Iranian missile launchers that had been repositioned beyond the range of existing precision weapons. If approved, it would mark the first ever operational deployment of that particular system anywhere in the world. One defense analyst offered a fairly blunt take on that request, describing it as something close to combat theater, a chance to demonstrate a long-troubled weapons program against an adversary already significantly weakened. As of the most recent public reporting, that specific deployment remained a request under consideration rather than a confirmed action. There's a reason so many of these programs are surfacing all at once instead of moving forward one at a time on their own separate schedules. War has a way of collapsing bureaucratic timelines. Programs that might have taken another 5 or 10 years of cautious testing during peacetime suddenly get pushed forward in a matter of months. Because the pressure to prove a capability works in front of a watching world becomes almost impossible to resist. That pressure cuts in two directions at once. It can produce genuine battle-tested breakthroughs. It can also mean weapons get used in real combat before every question about their reliability has actually been answered. Both of those things can be true about the exact same program at the exact same moment. And this particular missile currently sits right in that uncomfortable middle ground. So where does this actually leave things? A missile once treated as a punchline in defense budget hearings, a program that burned through billions of dollars and delivered failure after failure, is now mounted on the wing of an active combat bomber, flying missions connected to one of the most closely watched conflicts on the planet. And Iran, along with every other government watching this unfold from the outside, now has to plan for the very real possibility that the next strike could arrive faster than anything currently sitting in its defense network is capable of stopping. This is where the real weight of the story lives, and it's worth sitting with for a moment even after this video ends. Iran saw pieces of this coming, the buildup, the pattern, the pressure building month after month. But seeing the shape of danger and being ready to survive it are two entirely different things. Warnings only protect you if you're willing to fully believe them before it's too late to act. Iran believed just enough to prepare a little, but not enough to prepare completely. And in a conflict decided by seconds and altitude and unpredictable flight paths, that small gap between partial readiness and full readiness turned out to be the only gap that actually mattered. There's an uncomfortable question worth carrying with you. After watching all of this, how many other warnings, in how many other countries, are sitting in intelligence reports right now, technically known but not yet truly believed? History has a habit of repeating this exact pattern. A threat gets identified early. It gets discussed, documented, even predicted with real accuracy. And still, when it finally arrives, it lands like a surprise. Because knowing something intellectually and preparing for it emotionally are two very different processes, and only one of them actually saves you when the moment finally comes. This isn't unique to Iran, and it isn't unique to this particular war. It's a pattern that shows up again and again throughout history in governments and militaries, and honestly, in ordinary people's lives too. We see warning signs, we even talk about them out loud, and somehow we still find a way to convince ourselves the worst version of the outcome won't actually happen to us. Iran had years to close the gap between knowing and preparing. It closed some of that gap, but not nearly enough, and the world just watched what that difference actually costs when it finally gets tested in real time, under real pressure, with real consequences that can't be taken back. Does this mean Iran could have stopped everything if it had simply acted faster? Probably not entirely. Some of what happened was always going to happen once the larger forces at play were already in motion. But the margin between what did happen and what could have been different, that margin might have been smaller than anyone wants to admit. And that thought alone is worth remembering long after the headlines about this war eventually fade. Look at how many separate warning signs actually lined up here. The earlier strikes on nuclear sites, the quiet troop buildup across the region, the years of sanctions grinding away at the economy, the open knowledge that other major powers had already solved the hypersonic problem while the gap kept widening. None of these were hidden secrets. Analysts wrote about them, officials discussed them. Even ordinary people following the news casually could sense that something larger was building. And yet the distance between recognizing a pattern and actually acting on it in time turned out to be the deciding factor in almost everything that followed. That's rarely how these stories get told in the moment they happen. It usually takes distance and time and a careful look backward to see just how visible the warning signs actually were all along. Whatever you believe about how this ends, one thing is certain. This story is still being written in real time, one confirmed detail at a time, and it's worth watching closely as it continues to unfold. If this video helped you understand something you didn't fully see before, that's exactly why it was made. Thanks for staying until the end. I'll see you in the next one.